Black History Month. Romans. Africans first came to Britain with the Roman Empire, long before Britain began to build its own empire. It was invaded and conquered by the Romans in the year 43 AD. We know that Africans lived and settled in Roman Britain. Some places in Roman Britain may have even been more diverse than they are today. The Aurelian Moors. The Aurelian Moors were the first recorded group of Africans living in Britain, and they were soldiers in the Roman army. They came to defend the edge of the Emperor Hadrian's wall. The Aurelian Moors were highly respected people, considering it was a start to black history. The Romans weren't discriminating against anyone at the time, and everyone was treated equally. The only hierarchy was that in war, and whether they stood on the front line or not. Many black Africans decided to move to Roman colonies because it was better life for them. The Tudors. Ivory Bangle Lady. The Ivory Bangle Lady is name historians give to one Roman African whose skeleton was found in York. She was a young woman who died in the 3rd century. Ivory Bangle Lady was discovered buried in a stone coffin called a sarcophagus. She had expensive luxuries buried with her, jewelry made from silver, bronze, bone, and coloured glass, a mirror and a perfume bottle. She also had a black and white bracelet. The black bangles were made of jet, which was very expensive since jet only came from the northeast at the time. The royal household. John Blake was one of the several hundred black Tudors historians have found in the records. Many of them probably came to Britain from Spain and Portugal, countries with more contact and trade with Africa than England had. There was a fashion at the time for Africans to appear in royal courts, especially as musicians. Having Africans as part of the household was vital for rich Europeans to show off their international connections, and they let everyone know what they were part of a sophisticated modern world. Trading. Africans were a very important part in Tudor economics, for the Tudors were very reliant on the African trade market for their exotic fruits. You were well considered and very important if you had a banana. You were very well known and people would like to hang out with you, just for the social status of being friends with somebody who has a banana in their fruit bowl. Even King Henry VIII asked for an African cook when he was on vacation in the holidays, just for the exotic foods and the status. Georgian Britain. What was it? In the early 18th century, Britain's colonies in North America were making huge fortunes for the rich families that owned the plantations there. They grew sugar, cotton, and tobacco. The people who worked on these crops were enslaved black people who were brought over from Africa in slave ships. The same ships that carried the slaves were later filled with sugar and the other crops and sailed back to Britain. What was it like? Thousands died on the plantations due to neglect, not enough food, and they were beaten and overworked. The captains of the ship could make extra money by bringing enslaved black people back to Britain. These enslaved people were then bought by rich families and made them work for them as slaves. If the rich people were no longer wanted the slaves, they would then sell them to the newspaper. Why it was so awful. Owning enslaved black people were considered fashionable to the rich. They were keen to show off their human property. They sometimes included their portraits. Many of the black people that were brought to Britain as slaves were very young. Most boys and girls and women were less valuable. The enslaved children were dressed fashionably in expensive and colourful uniforms. They were given new names that sounded classical, such as Caesar, Scipio, and Pompey. They were not allowed to use their real African names. They were also forced to wear slave collars around their neck that were padlocked on. This was to show the public that the black person was somebody's property. As the enslaved black people longed to be free, some attempted to escape. The slaves that escaped were very valuable, so the owners would pay for advertisements, offering rewards for their recapture. These were known as hue and cry advertisements. They tell us how old the enslaved people were, what they looked like, whether they were boys, men, girls, women, and described their colourful uniforms that they were made to wear. Here's one of those advertisements. Who was Ignatius Sancho? A few of the free black people who lived in Britain wrote books about themselves. One of them was Ignatius Sancho. He was a black African man who was born on board a slave ship in 1729. He was brought up in a wealthy family who didn't think it was right for a black child to be taught to read and write, so he decided to educate himself. The Duke and Duchess of Montage, who lived nearby, helped him do so by giving him books and eventually working for them as a butler. When the Duke and Duchess died, they left Sancho money, and he became a shopkeeper in London, with his wife Anne, a free black woman. Sancho spent his times writing and became friends with famous writers and actors. This was significant because it wasn't common for a black man to be so important in the 18th century. Henry Box Brown. Who is he? Well, Henry was an African-American slave who was sold to work in a tobacco plantation. Henry was married with 4 children, however he wasn't allowed to live with them. His family was sold to a plantation. This fueled his urge to escape so badly, and he went on to become an author and a performer. How did he do it? Well, it wasn't easy for Henry to go through his plan. He needed help. Brown hired a carpenter to build a box, but the box was only built 1 meter wide. He also had help from his black friend James C. Smith, who was an African-American dentist at the time, and his white Native American friend Samuel Smith. The Smiths shipped him inside the box that was lined with cloth and had a single hole cut from at the top. The box was labelled dry goods. Henry was in the box for 27 hours, and he reached his destination in Philadelphia, where slavery was legal. What did he do then? Well, Henry went on to write his first book on his journey from Virginia to Philadelphia and becoming a free man. He performed his story in many theatres around the country, popping out of his box on stage to open it. However, Henry left for England after the law made it legal to hunt down slaves that were free. In England, he married again and had 2 more children. Sarah Forbes Vineta. Sarah was born into slavery at the age of 7 years old. She was sent to the Queen Victoria as a present from the Oyo Empire in Nigeria. She was shipped off to England to be the Queen's handmaid. However, the Queen took a liking to her and declared her smart and intelligent. Queen Victoria then paid for her education in Freetown, Sierra Leone. When she returned from her education in America back to England, she married a rich black businessman, and their marriage was heavily publicized and covered by all the press. When they had a daughter, she named her Victoria, the queenship place of her grandmother. This is one example of a life that was lived by a black person in Victorian Britain. It wasn't a good start to life to be born into slavery, but the ending is a happy one. The African music was in great demand after the Bohe brothers made it big in America. The brothers were famous for playing their banjos in the theatres and on the streets. Many fans often painted themselves with black polish just to look more like them. James Douglas Bohe and his brother George, black Canadians who moved to London and made their living as highly successful banjo teachers, sellers of banjos, composers, musicians, singers, dancers, theatrical managers, and promoters. The paper claimed that James had taught himself to play the banjo and could not read printed music. They came to England for the first time in 1881 as members of Harvey's Coloured Minstrels. When they went on tour, the Bohes lived in London and ran a successful banjo teaching studio. Students who did not wish to come to the studio could have their banjo lessons at their own houses. You didn't see. For many years, white people who called themselves Darwinists thought that black people were either a whole different type of species of human or underdeveloped people. Some people thought that black people were given to them by God to help with jobs on the farms or the tobacco plantations. The majority of black people were living in harsh conditions, barely any food and no clean water. Many famines happened because of this. Many slaves were already born into slavery. Women who were considered not fit for the job were told to have children that then would be used as slaves when they grew up. Many black Africans did get married and have children, but the men weren't allowed to live with their family and rarely got to see them. Soldiers from all over the world fought and died in World War I, including men from the British colonies in Africa and the West Indies. Many West Indian men felt loyal to the British Empire and saw it as an empire of freedom. For the love that we hold for the British flag, we should fight as brave men and die as heroes. Why was the British government not happy with the amount of black soldiers applying? Giving weapons and training to black men and sending them to fight Europeans would break the rule of colonialism. Black people should not be allowed to kill white people. However, some black servicemen did join regiments alongside white men and fought with them in Europe. Walter Tull has become the most celebrated black British soldier of World War I. Born in Kent, his father was from Barbados, where his grandfather had been enslaved. At 26 years old, he was already a famous footballer when he joined the army in 1914. He was quickly promoted when he went to France to fight with his regiment. He suffered shell shock and returned to action in the Battle of Somme and was decorated with the 1914 to 1915 Star and other British War and Victory medals, 10th of November 2019. He led his men as a second lieutenant until March 1918, when he was killed in action in France. Post-war ingratitude. African and West Indian regiments which had fought for Britain were not invited to march in the official victory parade in London 1919. Many went home disappointed. In most of the nations who engaged in the conflict, the role played by 4 million non-white, non-Europeans who had fought and laboured on the Western Front, and others in theatres of the war in Africa, the Middle East and Asia had been airbrushed from popular memory. Moreover, the war transformed the racial and political consciousness of a generation of black people, especially those who served in the military. This would shape the activism and everyday resistance of black people throughout the post-war period. Black Lives Matter. The forgotten heroes of World War II. Black soldiers were expendable, then forgettable. More than 600,000 Africans fought for Britain in World War II. Black and Asian troops fought beside the white comrades, but after the end of the World War, they suffered racial subjugation. By the end of World War II, Usubia Mbuki had faced deadly combat in the jungles of Burma and survived fearful ocean crossings stalked by submarines. But even the young Kenyan put his life on the line for Britain. He and more than 500,000 other African soldiers drawn from the Empire faced harsh discrimination from his own side. The black experience of being comrade. Black troops received the third party of the pay of their white contemporaries of the same rank. Some Africans were forcibly and secretly conscripted, while others were beaten by their superiors. Many ended up in poverty. A white private could earn 10 shillings for each month of service. For a black soldier of the same rank, just 3.5 shillings. White corporals would get 12 shillings per month of their service. For black corporals, just 4 shillings. Fight for freedom and justice, they said. When I got out, they gave me nothing, said Burma campaign veteran Mumbuki, now 100 years old and living in poverty in rural Kenya. Grace Mbite, a widow in her late 90s, reads her Bible in her home in the Kenyan highlands. On November 16, 2018, her husband Stanley Mwili was forcibly recruited into Britain's colonial army and returned from the service in North Africa, deeply traumatized by the horrors of combat. Some people think racism is a great way to hurt people. It's wrong because people can get bullied because of what they look like. It's not kind if you're racist.